A fragment of bone, no larger than a child's finger, sits behind museum glass in Truckee, California. The surface bears peculiar marks, thin, parallel scratches, too deliberate for animal teeth, too precise for natural decay. When sunlight reaches it through the eastern window each morning, the bone seems almost yellow, almost warm, as though remembering the body it once supported. The air in that display case has never been tested, but visitors have described something, a faint staleness, like opening a root cellar that has been sealed through a long winter. The temperature around the exhibit maintains itself at exactly 62 degrees, regardless of the climate control settings. Museum staff stopped questioning this years ago. This bone was recovered from a Sierra Nevada campsite in 1847. It belonged to someone who trusted their fellow travelers, someone who believed the journey west meant salvation. Here is your question before we proceed. If you were starving, truly starving, with death settling into your vision like frost on glass, would you consume the flesh of someone you loved to survive, or would you choose to die beside them in the snow? The Donner Party answered this question not once but over the course of 4 frozen months. It began with a letter. In the summer of 1846, a man named Lansford Hastings published a guide for emigrants traveling to California. He promised a shortcut, a new route that would shave hundreds of miles from the established Oregon Trail. He called it the Hastings Cutoff. He described it in language so seductive that families read his words aloud by candlelight, dreaming of fertile valleys and mild winters. Hastings had never actually traveled the route he recommended. George Donner was 62 years old when he gathered his family and joined the wagon train departing Springfield, Illinois. He was a prosperous farmer, a man of quiet dignity and absolute faith in American expansion. His wife Tamsin was a school teacher, delicate-boned and educated, who packed books alongside provisions because she believed the mind required nourishment equal to the body. They brought their children. They brought their life savings sewn into quilts. They brought expectations. 87 people departed that spring. The youngest was an infant, still nursing at her mother's breast. The oldest was a grandmother who had survived 6 decades of frontier hardship and believed herself prepared for anything. She was not. The wagon train moved westward through familiar territory until they reached Fort Bridger in late July. There, the group faced a choice. The established trail curved north through Fort Hall, adding weeks to the journey but following a path worn smooth by previous emigrants. Or they could follow Hastings' miraculous shortcut, supposedly saving time, supposedly easier. George Donner voted for the shortcut. Most followed. What no one understood, what Hastings had neglected to mention, was that his cutoff required crossing the Wasatch Mountains through terrain no wagon had ever successfully navigated, then traversing 80 miles of salt desert where no water existed, where animals would die of thirst, and men would begin to question God. The first signs of doom arrived quietly, as doom often does. A broken axle here. A lost ox there. Days bled into weeks as the party hacked through canyon brush that Hastings had described as open meadow. Children watched their parents argue. Wives watched their husbands age. The comfortable rhythm of the journey fractured into something desperate, something that smelled of sweat and silence and the slow death of optimism. At night, when the fires burned low, families lay in their wagons and listened to the wind, wondering if the sound they heard was weather or something older, something patient, waiting in the mountains ahead. A grandmother named Sarah Keyes had already died and been buried beside the trail in Kansas. Her grave would be the first of many, but she was fortunate in one regard. She would never know what became of the others. The salt flats broke them. Hastings had written that the crossing would take 2 days. It consumed 6. The ground was white as bone, hard as stone, and beneath the noon sun the temperature exceeded 100 degrees. Mirages rose like promises, lakes that did not exist, trees that dissolved upon approach. Oxen collapsed. Their tongues swelled until they could no longer bellow, only wheeze. Families abandoned wagons, left furniture and heirlooms in the alkaline dust, and walked. Some cattle simply lay down and refused to rise, their eyes glazing over as their owners continued westward without looking back. The Donner Party lost 36 head of cattle in that crossing. They lost most of their provisions. They lost something else, harder to name, a collective belief that their journey would end well. By September, they had fallen dangerously behind schedule. The mountain passes ahead would soon fill with snow. Everyone knew this. No one spoke it aloud. Then the killing began. A wealthy man named James Reed, one of the party's leaders, stabbed another emigrant named John Snyder during an argument over exhausted oxen. Snyder died within minutes. Reed was banished from the group, forced to continue alone without weapons or adequate supplies, his family remaining behind with the others. He rode toward California, expecting to die in the wilderness. He did not die, and this would matter. They reached the lake on October 31st, 1846. The water reflected mountains that seemed close enough to touch. The pass over those mountains appeared clear. One more push, perhaps, 2 days of climbing, and they would descend into the Sacramento Valley. They rested. They would push forward in the morning. That night the snow began. It fell softly at first, almost gently, as though the sky were offering a gift. But it did not stop. By morning, 5 feet had accumulated. The pass was buried. The wagons were buried. The oxen were buried. They were trapped. 81 people, including numerous children, imprisoned beside a frozen lake at an altitude of 6,000 feet. Their cabins were crude structures built from logs and canvas and desperation. The Donner family camped separately, 6 miles behind, at Alder Creek, having fallen further behind due to a broken axle. The snow continued. It would eventually reach 22 feet. They ate the remaining cattle first. When those were consumed, they ate the oxen hides that formed their cabin roofs, boiling the leather into a gelatinous substance that provided minimal nutrition. They ate bark. They ate twigs. They ate their dogs. Then the food was gone entirely. Picture a child, perhaps 8 years old, sitting in a frozen cabin beside a body. The body belonged to her uncle yesterday. Today it is something else. Her mother has told her not to look, but she cannot help herself. She watches as adults perform tasks that no child should witness, tasks involving knives and fire and portions of what used to be a person. She does not scream. She is too hungry to scream. She is too hungry to feel anything except a dull awareness that she is being offered something, and that she must choose whether to accept it. The cabin smells of smoke and iron and something sweetly rotten. Years later, survivors would describe this smell in letters they never sent, in diaries they burned before dying, in nightmares that visited them until their final breath. Some choices cannot be forgotten. Some choices become the person who made them. In mid-December, 15 of the strongest members attempted escape. They strapped improvised snowshoes to their feet and began climbing toward the pass, carrying 6 days of rations for what they believed would be a 6-day journey. It took 32 days. They became lost almost immediately. Storms pinned them against mountainsides. Their rations expired. 2 men, both indigenous guides who had volunteered to help, were shot for food. The survivors would later claim the guides had died naturally first. The truth grew complicated in the telling. Of the 15 who departed, 7 reached California alive. They stumbled into a settlement called Johnson's Ranch on January 18, 1847. skeletal figures with frozen extremities and eyes that seemed to hold depths no one wished to explore. They carried human flesh in their packs. Rescue parties departed immediately, but the snow blocked passage until late February. When rescuers finally reached the lake camp, they found scenes that resisted description. Survivors huddled in cabins half buried by snow, their faces blank, their movements mechanical. Around them lay human bones cracked open for marrow. Skulls had been opened, organs had been removed. Not everyone who survived had consumed human flesh. Some adults fed their children but refused to eat themselves. Some chose death over consumption. The mathematics of survival sorted people into categories that none of them had expected. Tamsin Donner, the schoolteacher, with her careful handwriting and her belief in education, refused to leave her dying husband George in the final rescue. She could have escaped. She chose to remain. When the last rescue party arrived in April, they found only her body, partially consumed, surrounded by scattered pages of books she had carried across 2,000 miles. 42 people died in the Sierra Nevada during that winter. 39 survived. The survivors scattered across California, many changing their names, many refusing to discuss what had happened, many living into old age without ever answering the question that strangers inevitably asked. But the Donner Party left behind more than bodies. They left behind the knowledge that ordinary people, farmers and teachers and children, could cross thresholds previously believed uncrossable, that the human body could be reduced to sustenance, and that those who crossed such thresholds could continue living, could raise families, could die peacefully in beds, carrying secrets that marked them as something other than what they had been before. This knowledge would echo forward through history, into darker rooms, into more deliberate hungers. Because the Sierra Nevada tested what people would do to survive when nature forced the choice upon them. But what happens when humans create such conditions deliberately, when starvation becomes a tool, when the choice is manufactured by other men? The answer waits in a city called Leningrad, in a winter that would last 900 days, where the snow also fell and fell and fell.